It makes sense when you think about it. The quiet kids, the queer kids, the nerds and the geeks and the loners. When everyone else is out there at bars and clubs until 2 in the morning, sloppy drunk and shoving their tongues against each other's uvulars in front of God and his brother. Where are they supposed to go? All the calm, hushed corners of the world are inaccessible after around 8 o'clock. No cafes to tuck into to sip something sweet while clacking away at a keyboard. No bookstores with their worn, welcoming armchairs looking to beckon in the weary. No libraries. Except Matt's. Matt Nelson, my boss, is the director of the night library, for lack of a better term. Does he possess the credentials to occupy the position of a library director? Let's just say, if tearing through a pack of cigarettes and a pot of coffee in an hour were the top qualifiers, there'd be no better man for the job. But the night library doesn't have a board of trustees to answer to, which means Matt's GED may as well be a master's. It isn't a public establishment. Nobody's paying for its existence with their tax dollars, and the books don't come straight off the press from the publishing house, ink still wet, pages still hot. I like to think of it as the half-price books of the library world. Our collection is made up of any and everything anyone is willing to contribute, which leaves us with a total sitting somewhere around a cool 1,000 items. It's a good thing too, because we wouldn't have enough of a staff to manage it all otherwise. In all, there are 7 of us. Or 8, if you count Doug, but no one's entirely sure he exists. Alice is our cataloguer, and Matt's very first employee. When he set out to open the night library's doors, he knew he would need a way to keep track of his inventory, and he only trusted himself to do so with the number of books he could count on both hands. The way he tells it, Alice laughed in his face when he propositioned her. She was working the streets at the time, and when he pulled up to her corner in his '97 Ford Ranger, cranking the window down at a geriatric snail's pace to ask if she was interested in alternative employment, she told him whatever he was paying in a week couldn't hold a candle to what she made in an evening. He handed her his card, which was actually the business card for a local nail salon, covered in whiteout and scribbled over with a Sharpie marker, and told her to give him a call if she changed her mind. To this day, she won't tell him why, but when his phone rang smack in the middle of the night, less than a week later, it was Alice on the other end. What in God's green hell would anybody want with a library open dusk to dawn? She asked him, once he'd elaborated on the position he was offering. Just let me know, he told her. She was outside the door 20 minutes later. After Alice came Della. She wandered inside one night in the dead of winter, fingertips purple and eyelashes weighed down with ice. Matt was mopping melted snow out of the entryway, and she stopped in front of him, blocking his path. "Can I help you?" he asked. No response. He took a moment to size her up, gauging the situation, and tried again. "Are you looking for work?" She snatched the mop straight out of his hand. She's never spoken a word to any of us, but not a speck of dust falls on a single surface before she catches it mid-air. We aren't sure if Della is even really her name. Matt just caught her writing it on the bathroom wall with foam cleaner one night, and when he asked her, there was no objection. Horace was next. He'd been a regular patron of the library for quite some time before Matt took notice of the way he meticulously studied the shelves, halting any time he spotted a misplaced item to correct it before moving on. Matt stopped him as he was straightening a row of outdated medical texts, and said if he was going to volunteer his time, he might as well get paid. Jenny followed not too long after, and she was certainly the most forthright of the crew. She marched directly up to the desk just before closing time and said to Matt, "Don't you have a life outside of this place?" Matt says now that he supposes he should have taken offense, but seeing as he did in fact not have a life outside of the library, he didn't. No, he told her plainly. Why? Because. Apparently, Jenny popped her gum here, which invited Matt to consider banning gum from the premises entirely. Then, he thought, given that he'd never banned anything from the premises, gum seemed like the wrong place to start. You're here like every night. Don't you want some time off? I could run the desk for you. Doesn't look very hard. Okay, Matt said. He gave her a crash course of the circulation system, which isn't a real circulation system at all. One of his tech acquaintances built the program, and it runs exactly as well as we need it to, with no room to spare. Tossed her the keys and headed home. Wiley would be the token charity case, except that they bust their ass harder than the rest of us put together for this place. The first couple of times they came around, they covered one of their eyes with their bangs and hung out in the library's dismal excuse for a teen area from sundown to sunup, never lingering quite long enough to be told that they had to leave before Matt locked up, but certainly cutting it close. While Matt was standing on a ladder one night, trying to stuff enough paper towels around a faulty sprinkler head to keep it from saturating a ceiling tile, Wiley nearly scared him to his death, coming up behind him without a sound. I want to make a deal with you, they said. Once Matt had recovered from his miniature heart attack and regained his balance, he peered down the ladder to find Wiley staring up at him, face fully bared to him for the first time. Right eye bloodshot and swollen with a bruise so dark it resembled a pit just beginning to yellow around the edges. All right, he agreed, not bothering to ask what the deal might entail. As it turned out, Wiley's bargain was this: anonymity in exchange for labor. No one can know where I am, Wiley explained. I can't give you my legal name, or an ID, nor my social. But I'll work hard and I'll do it for free if I can stay here. I won't run up the water or the electric. I won't turn any lights on or even use the bathroom during the day. It'll be like the building is empty the whole time it's closed. I swear. I just need somewhere to lock myself in. Matt's only conditions were that Wiley, A, accept a paycheck, and B, keep their arrangement quiet, as he didn't need everyone in a rough spot to come into him expecting that they could strike the same deal. I have no one to tell, Wiley said, and then asked where Matt kept his tools. If we've ever had a leak since, or a blown bulb, or a fried computer monitor, it hasn't lasted long enough for Matt to call a repairman before Wiley's had it fixed. As for me, it was sort of a fluke that I was hired at all. I don't sleep much during the night. In fact, I've only ever had one day shift job, and my body's internal alarm clock wasn't a fan of that agreement. I was working overnights at a nursing home before the library, and I happened to pass by on a night off after a walk, too antsy to sit alone in my apartment. I'd never noticed it before, which isn't unusual for me, as I pride myself in my attention span's ability to give goldfish a run for their money. But the dim glow emanating from inside among the sea of darkened storefronts stood out like a beacon. My first impression based on the interior of the building was that it had likely been a laundromat in a past life, with its paltry concrete floors and low-tiled ceilings. The short, sparse shelves lined along the entryway for new books and special displays I now know, led me in a natural progression to the circulation desk, where Matt had his face buried in his hands and Jenny was holding open a book next to him that had cracked fully down the spine. Loose pages lying haphazardly across the countertop. Can't afford to replace shit all the time, Matt was saying, muffled by his palms. Whatever. If it's too bad to glue it, just, I don't know, throw it away, I guess. I'm not sure what possessed me to do so, but I took a step forward, fingering the edge of the front cover. I can fix it, I said, and then, as though such a vague explanation would make the situation less awkward somehow, I'd do that. Fix books. Matt's head raised slowly, as though someone had attached it to a string. Got a whole tower in the back. Can you fix all of them? I mean, I'd have to look at them first, I told him. I've never done it on, like a professional level, but my grandpa had some book presses he left me when I was in high school, so I've been doing it as a hobby for 10 years, give or take. Matt seemed to mull this over for a moment. Most of what we've got's not anything special, but there are a couple of collector's items here and there. Signed copies, first editions, stuff like that. We can't find them damn near anywhere, and if you do, people want a pretty penny for them. What's your name? Adam. Matt stuck his hand across the desk. Welcome aboard, Adam. When can you start? That was 3 years ago, which doesn't sound like a ton of time, granted, but there are some things around here you have to get used to so quick that by 3 months in, you start to feel like a seasoned vet. Every place has its odd little ins and outs, of course. We've got plenty. The back door next to the dumpster sticks from the outside, so we have to prop it open to take the trash out, unless we want to walk around to the front. One of the bathroom lights is finicky. When the switch is flipped, they all shut off but the very center panel, and it takes a few tries to make it cooperate. Our power gets knocked out so easily in storms that we've got about a metric fuck-ton of battery-operated fans to keep cool, and a whole manual checkout system for when the computers are down. But, as inconvenient as these little quirks can be at times, they're things we're all more than happy to deal with day to day. Matt's a good boss. He takes care of us, with what little means he has. We don't get benefits, but he pays us for a full week of sick days each fiscal year, and we get paid holidays off. If we have something going on that we need to miss for, he never says no. We essentially set our own schedules, and there's no minimum to the number of hours we can work, so long as we're cool with the cut on our checks. The break room stays stocked with generic snacks and off-brand sodas, and as long as we're not tending to a patron, he genuinely couldn't care less whether we're on our phones or listening to music, as long as our work is done. We don't have a dress code, no staff meetings, no 8-hour trainings. I mean, I won't be a millionaire anytime soon, but the pay is good. Better than I expected. When Matt told me at the beginning of my interview, which was actually just me filling out paperwork, what the pay rate was, I couldn't help but raise a brow. I don't have a degree, I informed him, in case somehow he'd confuse me with someone whose life was far more put together, or any experience in the field, technically. I know, he said. Just think of it as incentive. I hope it's enough to keep you around. I didn't understand at first what the hell that was supposed to mean. We're in a slightly rougher area of town, so I figured maybe we'd run into the occasional dispute or keyed up addict. Then I finished my entry packet and flipped it over to find the last paper on the table, simply titled Staff rules. It read as follows. 1. If you come across a man named Doug, tell him that of course you recognize him. Furthermore, ask why he's introducing himself, as you've worked together since you were hired. He will laugh and ask your forgiveness for being so forgetful, at which point you should be clear to go about your day. However, if he happens to ask you if you think he's doing alright at his job, be sure to tell him he's doing so well that if he ever left, we could never hire someone else to take his place. 2. There is no pool in the library, not in the basement, which does not exist, nor on the roof. If someone asks you if you've been swimming in the pool yet, do not give a definitive answer. Simply say that you don't like to swim. Important, do not say that you can't swim, just that you don't enjoy it. If you see a pool, exit the building, and do not return until sunset the next evening. You're simply exhausted from working night shifts. 3. Do not bring peanuts or any peanut products into the building. Horace, our page, is allergic. 4. The second floor is only storage. Nothing is moving upstairs. If you think you hear anything unusual, i.e. scratching, stomping, humming, it's either the HVAC system or the pipes. Number 5. All of the keys that you need can be found on the keyring in the drawer below the time clock. If you come across a door that isn't labelled on the cheat sheet for the keys, you don't need to open it. It's likely just maintenance access. Number 6. Staff parking is in the upper lot. Number 7. When working in the children's area, do not be alarmed if books fall off the shelves from time to time. It's nearly imperceptible to the naked eye, but several of the shelves are built at a slight angle. Number 8. The coffee pot in the staff kitchen is free for everyone to use, and coffee supplies are located in the cabinet above the microwave. If you pick up the coffee pot and find that it is full of a dark, viscous substance, simply clean it out in the sink before using it. Just plug your nose while doing so. Number 9. We do not have gender-specific restrooms, and any protest in regards to such will not be tolerated. Number 10. If you see an elderly Hispanic woman dressed in a mourning garb, crying quietly with her head down at the table in the back corner next to non-fiction, do not approach her. However, if she makes eye contact with you of her own accord, be sure to offer her your condolences. If she signals for you to come closer, tell her that you're sorry, but you have got to get back to work. If she starts to stand, turn calmly away and begin walking at a brisk but unalarmed pace back towards the front of the building. Do not look behind you. Do not run. Number 11. On the last Saturday of each month, our custodian, Della, uses a specific cleaning solution to mop. The red coloration comes from the active ingredient, which is what protects the floors and keeps them from staining in the event of spills. It is not blood. Number 12. Please do not use Windex on the plexiglass windows of the meeting room. It streaks. Number 13. Keep an analog watch on your person at all times. If you ever feel that too little or too much time has passed since you entered the building, consult it rather than your phone or the clock on the computer. Whatever it says is correct. We look forward to working with you. Welcome to the Night Library. I've had several experiences worth recounting, to say the least, but the first story that comes to mind is in regards to rule number 2, so I thought I'd share that with you today. I'd been working at the night library for exactly 7 days, 4 shifts, but it was 1 week to the day since I'd been hired, and everything was going surprisingly smoothly. As any sane person would do, I had put the list of rules out of mind, gathering that they were nothing more than a tactic to haze new employees, assuming that I would have a leg up on them if I didn't acknowledge the list at all. I hadn't even mentioned it when I'd finished filling out my entry paperwork. Simply slipped it into my locker and handed the rest to Matt. Now, I was asked about it, of course, several times over the course of the following nights. Various co-workers approached me to inquire as to whether anything had happened to me yet. When I asked what they meant, their response was always some variation of, you know, the rules. And I would just snout and roll my eyes and be on my way. On the evening of my 4th shift, I had stepped away from the little hole in the back office that Matt had set up as a book-mending station for me, and was briefly helping Jenny out. We were unusually swamped at the desk, and Matt had taken off for the night, so I figured she could use a little extra manpower. We'd worked our way almost entirely through the line, and when the face of the last patron finally surfaced from the crowd, Jenny was still busy with someone else, so, naturally, it was me they looked to. "Hi," I said. "What can we do for you?" That was when I noticed their eyes. There wasn't anything wrong with them. Not technically. They were dark, but not unnaturally so. Not bloodshot. The pupils weren't abnormally large, but there was something behind them that... No. Let me try that again. There was nothing behind them. That was the problem. I looked away. "Paul," they said. I cleared my throat. "Sorry?" "Paul. You're Paul. I need help finding it." I laughed, and a cool air of relief washed over me. They looked soulless and creepy as hell, on purpose. Of course. Matt had put them up to this. Or, if not Matt, one of the other employees. "Sorry, buddy," I told them. "That's not gonna work on me. Nice job, though. You kind of freaked me out for a second." The patrons said nothing, just ever so slightly furrowed their brow and tilted their head to the side, as though they didn't understand what I was saying. "I need help finding your Paul," they repeated. I leaned partway across the counter, lowering my voice so that Jenny couldn't overhear. She seemed preoccupied enough, but you never quite know with her. "Look, dude, I don't want to spoil the fun for everyone else, so I'm going to let them think you're pulling one over on me for a while, okay? But I'm not buying it. I'll walk away from the desk with you, but once we're out of the line of sight, you can drop the act." This seemed to satisfy them well enough, because they turned and began heading opposite my direction. I quickly ducked out from behind the counter to follow. We walked in silence until we were safely hidden in the stacks, and then I stopped, reaching out to place a hand on their shoulder. "All right, pal, I think we've made it far enough." They faced me, and I waited for the facade to fall away. It didn't. "You're Paul," they recited once more. Slowly, a quiet unease began to creep up my spine. I managed. "Where is it?" For a moment, I considered. There was absolutely no way in hell any of this rules bullshit was real. But why were they so dedicated? "Is Matt paying you to do this?" They stared blankly at me, the same dead eyes as before, unblinking and cold. "Where," they demanded icily, "is your Paul?" As little stock as I had put into the list, it had, in its absurdity, stuck with me in such a way that made it difficult not to recall near to every detail. There is no pool in the library, I remembered reading, and then, not in the basement, which doesn't exist. It's in the basement? I tried, fearing that the next query would be where the basement was located. But no more questions came. Instead, the patron nodded and left me alone between Stephen King and Leanne Moriarty. I shouldn't have followed them. For countless reasons I shouldn't have. But I needed to know what was going on. So, I peeked around the edge of the shelf, ensuring that I'd given them enough leeway not to take notice of me trailing them. And then I set off. They were headed toward the children's area, which was entirely across the building from where we'd just been, and I was forced to keep my pace brisk so as not to lose sight of them. They bobbed and weaved in and out of my view, but I always managed to catch up just before it was too late. We traversed through the baskets of puzzles and blocks, along the dingy train mat thrown thoughtlessly across the largest expanse of open floor, and somewhat to my right, a read-along book that had been left open was stuck on a loop of animal sounds. We passed by the library's small collection of second-hand leapfrog learning pads and stepped over a spilled bin of well-worn stuffed animals, me keeping as quiet as I could all the while. Finally, we reached the rear wall, and I saw something I'd never noticed before. There was a door. Nothing about it was special or notable in the slightest. It was a metal rectangle that had been painted the same deep, flat shade of blue as the building's exterior doors, and it was fitted with an identical window so high up I would have needed a ladder to see what lay beyond. As was the only logical next event in our sequence, the patron approached it and turned the handle, which opened to them fluidly and without issue. Half of me hoped it would do the same when it was my turn. Half hoped it wouldn't. The door wasn't loud. I wasn't particularly concerned that they'd hear me breach it once it had fallen closed behind them. But just to be safe, I counted off 10 Mississippis before easing it open and slipping inside. Immediately, I was immersed in darkness. It would have been total had it not been for the dim glow permeating through from the bottom of the set of descending steps before me. My brain, scrambling to compute, insisted that the lack of basement in the building must have been part of the elaborate ploy. The fact that I'd never noticed the door didn't mean it didn't exist. Clearly it did, as I'd just used it. I'd only been here a week. It wasn't like I'd had a chance to explore every cubic inch of the place. Taking a steadying breath, I mentally chastised myself for being so gullible and started down the stairs. It took longer than I felt it should to reach the end. Far longer. But I chalked it up to anticipation and kept on until I reached a level concrete platform. The only turn to make was a right one, so I took it, drawing steadily closer to the disembodied light source. I travelled down a narrow corridor, minding my step once I realised that the floor was covered in about 1/8 of an inch of water, just enough to result in a soft, echoing splash if I swung my foot down with enough force. I didn't hear anything else ahead of me, but the patron hadn't preceded me by much. They had to be fairly close. Soon, the hallway opened into what I understood to be the basement. Beams and pipes littered the ceiling in an impossible maze, and I found that the light I had been following was produced by a single low-wattage bulb suspended from the rafters by a wire. I could see the center of the room clearly. but the edges blurred back into shadow. Straight ahead, I thought something shifted, but I couldn't be sure. Considering that I was out in the open now, with nowhere to hide, I called out a reluctant, "Hello?" No direct response came, but there was a quiet skittering from the same area where I thought I'd seen motion. So I moved toward it, against my better judgment, squinting in an attempt to make out a shape of any form. When I finally settled on one, it was the yawning, black mouth of an entryway. Almost blindly, I felt my way forward and stuck my hand inside to be met with empty air. The basement was cooler than upstairs already, but as I stepped fully through, I estimated the temperature drop to be another 5 degrees at the very least. The water that had veiled the floor from the bottom of the stairs had never receded, but it grew a hair deeper here, just enough so that it began lapping at the canvas above the soles of my shoes. "Hello?" I asked again, too unsure of my surroundings to go any further. I stood my ground and listened intently. This time, I could swear I heard a faint splash. It's difficult to explain what happened next. It was as though a film of a sort lifted from the entirety of the premises, and with it, the darkness. Not like someone had flipped on a switch, more like opening a blackout curtain. That's when I realized that it was because something was emerging from underwater. Before I go into detail about that, let me set the scene for you. As soon as my environment was illuminated, my heart gained sentience and decided there was no time like the present to explore the outside of my chest. I was the origin of freeze, being tacked onto the old flight or flight adage. But once I'd thawed, I took a liberal, stumbling step backward, so close to the space my toes had just inhabited that I'd have been done for had I allowed myself so much as a readjustment. There was a pool, or rather, a pit full of water, so dark and deep it appeared bottomless. Something about it affected my perception of the rest of the space. It was so all-encompassing that everything around it seemed to be pulling toward it as though it was the center of gravity, dizzying and cloying. Thankfully, however, my focus was instantaneously directed elsewhere. Have you ever seen an anglerfish? I assume you have, but if not, take a second to Google it. What had arisen from the depths of the pool, pond, liquid grave, greatly resembled one in several respects. The most notable being the giant, pulsating bulb protruding from the center of its head, and dangling in such a way as to perfectly illuminate the second most notable feature: the teeth. The most prominent difference between the thing before me and a traditional anglerfish was the size. For example, a fully grown anglerfish generally reaches the length of a ruler, but has on rare occasion been known to scarcely outgrow a yardstick. A yardstick may have been a match for a single dagger-like protrusion jutting like a stalagmite from this creature's jaw. I ran, slipping along the damp floor and barely catching myself on the walls several times before finally finding myself in the stairwell again. I began ascending it with all the force and swiftness in my being. They say the drive home always feels shorter, and this was apparently applicable to the trip up the stairs from the gate to hell versus down the stairs to it as well. because it felt as though not a second had passed before I was shoving the door open and collapsing onto the carpeted ground outside to catch my breath. When I got my bearings and stood, glancing quickly over my shoulder to be sure I hadn't inadvertently invited anything to accompany me out of the basement, I felt my stomach plummet. The door was gone. I looked insane by the time I made it back to the desk, and Jenny wasn't shy about telling me so. "What happened to you?" she asked. "Did somebody waterboard you, or is that sweat?" "I saw it," I told her. "The pool." She cocked one brow, eyes minutely widening. "Welcome to the club, noob. Get out of here. I'll see you tomorrow." I got out. Needless to say, I started studying that list like gospel the next night, and never questioned it again. It saved my ass a fair few times now, as it has everyone's here. Now, before you ask why I don't quit, why any of us just don't quit, I have to admit that I don't have a solid answer for you. The money is definitely a part of it. Matt knows what he's doing, buttering us up, giving us incentive not to seek out alternative employment. He keeps the staff small and cuts corners pretty much anywhere else he can, so he's able to pay us what he does. But there's something else too, something too intangible to verbalize. And it's unspoken between the lot of us that the sensation is mutual. We're just supposed to be here. Besides, I don't know if the library would take too kindly to us leaving. In a place as unique as the Night Library, there are bound to occasionally be hazards to the general public. Our rules are only given to staff. We don't attach a copy to every patron registration form we hand out, for a multitude of reasons. And I think I can speak for all of us when I say the most prominent of those is that we simply don't need to. Sure, there's the fact that no one would believe the rules in the first place, or if they did, it would likely incite mass panic. But we haven't really come across either of those issues in a serious capacity, because the rules generally seem to only regard our staff. Something about signing off on a job offer here commits us to the library in a way that means we're no longer blind to what's going on behind the curtain, so to speak. I've tried to ask Matt if he knows why that is on plenty of occasions, but he's pretty dodgy about it. So I've come to terms with the idea of never getting an answer. It's just the way things are. As long as our patrons aren't affected, the technicalities don't really matter. However, as with any rule, there are exceptions. The particular exception that brought about today's story is what I like to refer to as the revival clause. I learned about it in an innocent enough way. We have a regular patron named Doris, or Dory if you're familiar with her, which we all are, who Matt pointed out to me within my first few months of work. "See her?" he asked one night, tapping my shoulder with his knuckle to get my attention. I was checking in a stack of books I'd just brought back to the desk from being mended, and I raised my head, following his line of sight to the front door, where a woman was entering in a wheelchair, an oxygen mask secured to her face. I nodded in confirmation. "Keep an eye on her," he told me. "If you see anything today, or if anybody does, so does she. She's a special case. Try to make sure nothing happens." I furrowed my brow, confused. "What do you mean? Did she, used to work here or something?" Matt shook his head, chewing on the inside of his cheek. "No. She had a heart attack last year that, it killed her. Clinically. They were able to bring her back after a minute or so, but it changed something." I set my books down, turning to face Matt. "Changed something how?" "We hadn't seen her in a few months. We knew something had to be wrong. Her health's always been bad, so we thought life had finally just given up on her. But then she came back, told us what had happened. We didn't think anything of it at first. And then, one Saturday, she was on her way out and started screaming. I ran up to the vestibule, and there was Della, mopping the floors with, her cleaning solution?" I supplied, confused. "Yeah." Matt cleared his throat. "So, when Dory went into hysterics about all that blood, I knew something wasn't right." I blinked. Wait a minute. Are you saying it doesn't look like that to everyone? I thought that was one of the normal rules, like the Windex thing or the parking lot. Does that mean it is blood? Is it blood, Matt?" For a moment, Matt was quiet. "I guess you were going to find out eventually," he said, voice gruff. I could feel that my eyes were wide, but I wasn't quite sure how to remind them that they didn't operate on a hand crank. Where the hell does it come from? I stage whispered, and then, when a second, arguably more horrific thought came to mind, why is she mopping our floors with it? Matt waved a hand dismissively. "Not issues you need to concern yourself with. I'm gonna step out for a smoke. Just watch her." Now, when I said my introduction to the revival clause was innocent, I meant that it consisted of nothing more than a conversation. I was mildly traumatized, sure, but nothing happened to Dory that day as a result of it. However, that doesn't mean it never caused anyone harm. Last year, as I was in the back reattaching a book's hinge, Wiley knocked on the doorframe of my office, for lack of a better term. "Hey," they said. "I just wanted to give you a heads up that La Moya de Luto is here. Stay out of non-fic tonight." I wiped the binding glue off my fingers onto a cloth and swiveled my chair around. "Sounds good. Everybody okay?" "Yeah. Hugo already left for the night, so I think it's just me, you, and Matt here. I'm working on installing some new barcode scanners, and then I'm heading out too." "Cool," I said. "Thanks for letting me know." They offered me a two-fingered salute as they departed. I'd seen her before, the morning woman. The situation had only ever progressed as far as offering my sympathy. She'd never beckoned me over to her or tried to follow me. So, aside from feeling slightly on edge, I wasn't greatly impeded upon by Wiley's warning. I simply hollered over my shoulder for Matt to let me know if he needed help on a circ and kept working. Hours passed. Several. So many that I'd mostly forgotten to be on alert by the time I made my way out of my cave and set off into the stacks, still just aware enough to not venture into non-fiction. I was shelving some Douglas Adams books I'd just finished repairing. I've seriously debated trying to contact Macmillan to ask if they can please find some other way to carry out their personal vendetta against the guy, besides binding every one of his novels like dog shit. And I distinctly felt eyes boring into the back of my head. When I spun around to discover who they belonged to, I was met with a girl. I instantly recognized her, although I didn't know her by name. She frequented the library during the week, and had mentioned to me before that she liked to come in after she got off at work at the hospital to decompress. "Oh, hey, I didn't hear you come up behind me," I told her. "What can I do for you?" She took a step toward me. The motion was jerky, as though she was reluctant, and it encouraged her thick, pen-straight hair to envelop her brown shoulders like a curtain. She mumbled something, too low for me to hear. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't catch that." One of her arms gripped the other, and it looked like she was trying to hold herself still. Again, she mumbled something unintelligible under her breath. "Are you all right?" I asked. This time, when she spoke, I heard her. "Uno para la tristeza." Unease began a slow creep over me. I don't speak Spanish," I said. This had never come up in conversation between us before, given that she never spoke Spanish to me. But I attempted to hold on to hope that she had some reason, unbeknownst to me, to believe that I might. "Uno para la tristeza," she repeated. "Dos para la alegría." "Are you counting something?" It was true that I didn't speak Spanish, but I'd taken a couple of semesters of it in high school and paid enough attention to pick up on the most basic words and phrases. But 1 for and 2 for what? At the speed of the O2 dial-up, my brain allowed a memory to filter through. "Tristeza," my freshman Spanish teacher had said, contorting his mouth into an overly dramatic frown. My little trick for remembering this word is that it sounds like tryst, which is something people are often sad to find out their partners are having behind their backs. Tristeza. Sadness. Sorrow. Uno para la tristeza. 1 for sorrow. On autopilot, though I hadn't heard it in probably 2 decades, my mind filled in the next line of the old magpie nursery rhyme. 2 for joy. The girl stood before me, trembling, waiting. 3 for a girl. I continued aloud, though every fibre of my being was sounding alarms against my doing so. Desperately, she reached out to me. 4 para un niño, she recited. I took her hand in both of mine. 5 for silver. 6 para el oro. 7 for a secret, I finished. Never to be told. "Do you know my secret, Adam?" Instantly I went cold. But I did know. I did. "You've died before," I guessed. "Haven't you?" The girl slumped, an expression of relieved surrender overtaking her. Her eyes began to well with blood. "No." I held fast to her wrist. No, stay with me. Do not move, okay? Don't move. Matt?" "I have to go now," she said. "I have to go with her." "Matt!" It was too late. Before Matt would have had so much as a chance to intervene, the morning woman was there, blocking the exit directly next to us at the end of the row. The veil that typically shrouded her face consisted of thin, loose-knit lace, which only clearly exposed her eyes. But it was lifted now, and her cheeks were streaked with dried brown-red trails, lashes matted and heavy. Necrosis had eaten holes through her lips, and her long yellow teeth, peeked through in several places, spittle stringing between them as her swollen tongue parted them to speak. "Vienes," she rasped, raising one gnarled, crooked finger to the girl's chest. The girl strained against my grip, releasing a shuddering sob. "Come on," I said, tugging desperately at her arm. "This way." She didn't budge. It was as though her feet were cemented to the floor. "It's okay," she told me. "Let go." I refused, clamping down even tighter. La Muya de Luto glided toward me, and I sucked a breath in, squeezing my eyelids shut and stifling a gag at the scent of her putrid flesh. The last thing I felt before losing consciousness was the brush of her ice-cold, ragged nails against my forehead. When I came to, I was lying on the floor in the break room. Matt was standing at the counter, pouring coffee into his signature mug. World's best grandma. He found it in a cabinet when he bought the building. And when he saw that I was awake, he held it up to me in a cheers motion. "Hey, slugger," he said. "How you feeling?" I pushed myself up onto my elbows and assessed. My head was pounding, my mouth incredibly dry. But otherwise, I wasn't much worse for wear. "Okay," I answered. "Okay," he echoed. "Gonna quit on me?" I blew a half of laughter out of my nose. "Nah, I don't think so." "Good. Then go home. I'll see you tomorrow night." Over the following weeks, missing posters began cropping up around town. They depicted the girl from the library, of course. Her name was Mina Alcalde. She was a 23-year-old medical student at the local university. Her parents' contact information was listed below her photograph, as well as a sizable reward for her safe return. Every time I saw one, my stomach flipped. I debated calling them on several occasions, just to try and offer them some kind of closure. But what could I have said? Stop looking for your daughter. She's been taken by what I'd guess is probably the spirit of a dead woman to God knows where, and she's never coming back. So I never did. The months passed, and eventually the posters became fewer and further between. But I never forgot her face. To this day, damn near every time I close my eyes, I see hers glazing over with blood. I hear her silently pleading with me, both to help her and to set her free. I try to tell myself it wasn't my fault, that these things are never in our control. But on the worst nights, when I can't sleep without her watery voice resonating through my entire head, begging me to let the mourning woman take her, I wonder if there was something more I could have done. I wonder if I could have saved her. In today's post, I want to tell you all about the first time I went upstairs. As unbelievable as it sounds, it was literally a dark and stormy night, and also a Friday the 13th, in October, under a full moon. Nah, I'm just kidding. It really was storming though. But it was late spring, and the rain was nice and light, and even a little unseasonably warm. Kind of made for the perfect cozy library aesthetic atmosphere, if you're into that sort of thing. I was pretty well caught up on the books that needed repairing for the moment, so our cataloguer, Alice, had asked me if I had time to pull a list of materials for her that she'd accidentally only saved brief records for. Nothing out of the ordinary had gone on so far during the evening. It had been quiet, mostly. We'd signed a couple of new patrons and helped an elderly couple print out some shipping labels earlier in the shift. But basically, everyone had cleared out by midnight. I was pulling from near the section Horace was shelving in, and we were making idle conversation, by which I mean I was talking at him and he was grunting in response. But in the midst of a sentence, I stopped. Above us, something had cut me off. Thump, screech, thump. What the? Horace, did you hear that? Hear what? Horace asked absently, eyes still locked mechanically on the task before him. Upstairs, I insisted. I swear to God, something just... Thump, screech, thump. That! You had to hear that. Slowly, Horace looked up at me. I'd never seen an expression on his face quite like the one he wore in that moment. It conveyed a litany of emotions, ranging from fear to frustration to desperation, and he shook his head in a singular, pointed motion. No, he said. No, I don't hear anything. Neither did you. And if you did, it's just the ducts. But no, Adam, he pleaded. There's nothing up there. You know that. Just ignore it. Okay, I conceded. Sorry, you're right, I know. The sound didn't stop for at least half an hour. If anything, it grew louder and more persistent, though that may have just been my brain's progressive inability to block it out. But I did my best, and eventually it did cease. Once we'd had 10 or so minutes of consistent quiet, Horace's giant shoulders visibly relaxed. Do you have anything out of repair that needs to be shelved? He asked me. No, I said. You've gotten them all, I think. Then I'm going home. I'll see you tomorrow. See you then, I agreed. He left. Once I'd finished pulling Alice's books, there were a lot. I probably looked like a grandfather, the way I had to inch the cart across the floor. I took them back to her desk, playfully bumping into the back of her wheelchair with the truck. I'm filing for workers' comp, she threatened, not bothering to turn around. Thanks, nerd. Anytime, I told her. Except when I don't have something better to do. She still didn't turn, just leaned her head back so far it looked like she was being exercised. Did you hear the... ruckus? She asked, gesturing with a glance to the ceiling. Up there? There was a step stool tucked behind the filing cabinet next to me, and I pulled it out, sitting down atop it and scooting it closer to her. Okay, yes, I whispered, although to my knowledge, there was no one else in the back office. But Horace wouldn't talk about it, which I know is a rule, that there's nothing upstairs or whatever, but there obviously is. Alice finished. Yeah, it sounded pretty fucky, whatever it was. Have you ever been up there? I asked. Nah. Alice righted herself, pushing off one side of her desk, and then the other to swivel her chair back and forth. This bad boy can climb a set of stairs like a champ, but it's not too quick on the uptake, and I'm not willing to gamble on how fast I could make it back down if something was after me. Besides, personal code of conduct is to leave well enough alone in this place. Maybe it's why it's easier for me to talk about it all, because I'm just guessing at what's going on. Wait, all of it? You've never seen anything? Nothing, Alice clarified. But not much. I've never seen the pool or gone upstairs or tried to figure out any of the mystery keys that just appear on the ring sometimes. Nothing avoidable. I've been here a long time, almost as long as Matt. He's done a lot to protect me. I mean, he does whatever he can to keep us all safe, obviously. But when I started here, it was just the two of us. And there was a lot he was still figuring out, which meant it was especially dangerous. If some new weird shit came up, Matt explored it, alone. A lot of times that meant he got hurt, but I never did. And that was 100% thanks to him. So it would just kind of feel like slapping him in the face and not to take any precaution he offered me, if that makes sense. Yeah, I said. Yeah, that makes sense. Thump. Screech. Thump. The sound emanated from above us once again, but this time it was immediately followed by something else. A paralyzing, gut-wrenching scream. I jumped. Alice did too, hand to her chest. Jesus H, she breathed. Where's Matt? Is he still here? I don't know. I managed. I think so. Somewhere. Is it not something you've ever heard before? No, Alice admitted, leaning down to unlock her chair's brake. I'm gonna go look for him. You just don't do anything stupid. Now, I'm not sure if you've gathered yet from the first couple entries of this series, but telling me not to do anything stupid is kind of like taking a salt shaker to a slug and telling it not to die. In my defense, I'm almost never just charging straight at something I know might get me maimed or killed without a decent enough reason that I might deem the odds acceptable. And in this situation, I genuinely did intend to keep myself planted firmly on the step stool and wait for Alice to return, hopefully with Matt in tow. But then, the sound came again, and following it, another scream. This one broke off into a sob, and directly afterward, the first audible words. Help! Can anyone hear me? Please, help me! I froze, and listened, and waited. Thump. Screech. Thump. Please, God, please, somebody help me, it's... Screech. Silence. Quieter than dead air. The absence of sound, my own breathing, quick and shallow, was the only noise that existed. There was no electricity humming, no air flowing through the vents. Absolutely nothing. That, somehow, was worse than the screaming. It was an infinitely less alive sound, which made it infinitely more chilling. And I physically could not sit idly with it in anticipation. So I got up. Should it have been to look for Alice and Matt? Probably, yes. But there's something about a certain level of adrenaline that impairs logic and reason. So what did I do? You guessed it. I'd been in our mechanical room plenty of times before. That's where we store donated books until Alice can get to cataloguing them. And it's also where Della keeps her cleaning supplies, which we all need access to from time to time. But I'd never gone up the stairs. First time for everything, is what I figured. I wasn't sure if I wanted to make my presence known or not, so I kept my mouth shut, tiptoeing up each step and making sure not to scuff my shoes along the grip of the edges. It felt like it took ages to reach the top, as cautious as I was being. But I got there eventually. and when I did, I didn't see anything. I mean, I could see. The lights were on, if dim. Some of them looked as though they were meant to be fluorescing, but had burned out at some point in the likely distant past. But nothing appeared to be amiss. There were totes and boxes stacked precariously atop one another in the center of the floor, and to the sides were all the HVAC machines, their green sensors tinting the room in a strange hue. Tentatively, I made a lap around the perimeter. Nothing stirred. Nothing made a peep. I knew, rationally, that I should cut my losses, or my wins depending on how you look at it, and get back to the safety of the office before anything had a chance to rear its ugly head. But I also knew what I'd heard, and I wasn't about to be gaslit by whatever had lured me up there in the first place. There was nowhere to hide on the outskirts, but I sized up the mound of miscellaneous objects in the middle of the floor. There could be something under the boxes. In them, maybe. I walked slowly over, taking a breath to still myself, and toed the outer edge of the pyramid, jumping reflexively back in anticipation. But I didn't need to, it seemed. I apparently hadn't upset the balance. The mound remained intact and undisturbed. Feeling slightly braver, I stepped forward and kicked it again. This time with enough force to rattle it all the way to the top, but not so much as to knock anything over. Still, once it had settled, nothing emerged. Something did, however, fall from the fucking ceiling. If you've ever seen a horror movie where the big bad creepy crawly is lurking above the protagonist's head and wished you could scream at them to just look up already, rest assured that I have too. You probably tell yourself that you'd never be so oblivious or unobservant, that you would check every inch of your surroundings, overhead included, and possibly prioritized. I know, because I always told myself the same. The thing is, in real-life scenarios, you just don't anticipate an animatronic velociraptor pterodactyl hybrid swooping down and entrapping you in its enormous goo-covered wings. Hearing that now, it sounds kind of hilarious. So, for the sake of the atmosphere, just understand that it absolutely was not. I'd barely caught a glimpse of it before I was completely enveloped in warm, sticky blackness. But what little I had seen was nearly enough to send me straight out of consciousness. I knew if I was going to, not pass out, I needed to slow my breathing, stop thrashing fruitlessly around, and gather whatever information I possibly could from my current position. Its grip on me was tight, but not so much so that I felt suffocated, which gave me a glimmer of hope that perhaps whatever it was, it didn't plan to constrict me to death. I was crushed against its body, which my cheek registered as hot metal of some sort. But when I wiggled my fingertips against what I could reach of its wings, they felt leathery and soft, almost like a tanned cow's hide. Quickly, I learned the source of the thumping and screeching that had given the thing away. Every step it took, jostling me from side to side, resulted in a resounding thud. And between each footfall, its tail scraped tinnily across the concrete floor. I wanted to cover my ears, but my arms were pinned to my sides, so I settled for gritting my teeth instead. We made several passes back and forth from one end of the room to the other, and I realized at some point that it was beginning to grow agitated. It was huffing great breaths out of its nose, stomping harder and harder, swinging its tail more and more frantically. I was still far too shaken to use rational thought, no matter how hard I tried. But I did eventually come to surmise that it may have been angry it couldn't fly while holding me captive. So I did the only thing I could. I waited it out. I was, of course, desperately wondering where Matt was. Maybe he'd left without telling us, I reckoned, and Alice hadn't been able to find him after all. Maybe she tried to call him, and he hadn't answered, so she'd had no choice but to leave me to my own devices. She certainly shouldn't risk coming to look for me alone, if there was a chance she wouldn't be able to get away quickly enough to save herself. The mechanical dinosaur bird dragged me over the length of the space for what could have been minutes, or hours, or days for all I knew, and by the time it finally slowed to a stop, I felt delirious. The wet, sloughing sound its wings made as it unwound them from around my body made my stomach turn, and just as I tried to remind myself to be grateful that at least the slime coating me from head to toe was odorless, the thing opened its mouth. The stench that emanated from it was unlike anything I had, or have to this day, honestly, ever experienced. It was worse than death, worse than rot, worse than decay, worse than a combination of every disgusting aroma I'd ever been subjected to, all at once. It knocked me flat on my arse, which turned out to be a damn shame for me, because once I'd landed, I couldn't unglue myself from the floor. I was forced to take in its full form now, and my brain refused to process any of what it was seeing, catapulting me instantly into a state of derealization. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, with a wingspan twice as long, and I could see clearly that the bronze making up its abdomen, head, and legs had begun to oxidize, giving the effect of flaking skin. Its wings resembled bats' wings, and it stretched them. Each individual vein they contained was exposed by the light behind them. It was just going to eat me right there. I was fairly sure of that now, even as badly as it had clearly wanted to savor me on the ceiling instead, for which there was a reason, but that's, well, another story for another time. It craned its long neck down, reminiscent of that of a large desk lamp's, and stopped short, only inches away from my face. Its mouth was still open, but what I saw inside gave me pause. It was another beak. This one was smaller, but it was behind the creature's jagged teeth, in the place where I would have expected to see a uvula in a human. Slowly it began to creak open as well. Past its exterior, I could barely make out what looked to be a small round speaker, the type that might have been found in an old-school intercom system. To my horror, it began to crackle to life. "Help!" it pleaded, deafeningly loud. "Can anyone hear me?" I felt my blood turn to ice as it began to scream, and scream, and scream. It was taunting me. That was all there was to it. It was solidifying what I'd already known. There had never been a person in danger. It had cast its hook, and I'd taken the bait. Its vicious, stringy saliva dripped onto my head and shoulders, and I was entirely powerless to stop it. No matter how hard I fought to move, I clamped my feet together, forcing back wave after wave of nausea. I'd always expected that if I was of sound enough mind to be aware at my time of death, I would have at least one profound thought. But in that moment, nothing but pure, white panic filled my mind. I was terrified, simply and truly. There was no room for anything else. A thin, black tongue rolled out of its mouth, the texture similar to a cat's, with sharp, angled barbs pointing towards its throat. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't bring myself to. Couldn't even close my eyes. I needed to fully experience the last moments of my life, whatever they might entail. I instinctively believed, when I first heard the pop, that the creature's head had exploded of its own volition. I couldn't quite see what was going on, as I was too busy blinking blood, at least that's what I assume it was, out of my eyes. But then there was silence, save for the sound of wires short-circuiting, and then Matt was speaking, as close to frantic as I'd ever heard him, yelling out imperatively that I respond if I could. My lips were covered in blood too, so I hummed in response, not willing to test what might happen if I were to accidentally ingest it. "Fuck," Matt said when he reached me, kneeling and pulling the sleeve of his shirt down over his hand to wipe off my mouth and eyes. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and then amended. "Bad?" I coughed, shaking my head. No, I'm fine. Just stuck. What did you do?" "Shot the bastard," he told me, unsheathing the knife hooked to his belt and beginning to work at the goo, cementing me to the floor. "Sometimes the solution's easier than you'd expect." Once he'd cut me out of confinement, he held me to my feet, giving me a good once-over to make sure I hadn't sustained any injuries I was in too much shock to feel yet. This was a particularly easy feat, given that if any of my own blood had been displaced, it would have been red, contrasting starkly with the muddied green of the monsters. "Thanks," I said. Thank you." "Don't come up here again," he told me. "The rules exist for a reason." I know. I'm sorry, I just thought someone was in trouble." "If you ever think someone's in trouble, you come find me. I'll handle it." We trudged back downstairs, my feet squelching every time they made contact with the ground. I didn't ask if Matt had a plan for the creature's body. I didn't ask if he'd known how to kill it, because he'd run into one before. I didn't ask if I was fired. Back at the desk, Alice told me she wanted to punch me, but it wasn't worth getting that nasty shit all over her hand, which I thought was fair enough on both accounts. She also told me it had taken her a while to track Matt down. He'd been outside in the storage shed, and then reminded Matt she had explicitly instructed me not to do anything stupid while she was gone, which I corroborated. If anyone was going to be in trouble, it had better be me. But I wasn't. Matt sent me home to clean myself up and get some rest, both of which I did. When I showed up for work the next night, it was as though nothing had ever happened. We never spoke of it. I fully intended, after that night, to heed Matt's warning to never set foot upstairs again. Truly, I did. And I did heed to it. Until about a week ago. But I think I've given you enough to digest for now. And there's something to the belief that you shouldn't pry at a fresh cut. So, maybe another time. It had been a bad night. We have those here, as you know. Unless you don't know, in which case you should start from the beginning. Nor if you missed my last update about the green-blooded prehistoric animatronic monstrosity, then I'll link it below. Anyway, we're prone to bad nights, but this was a bad night. Wiley had accidentally unlocked a door, rule number 5. I'd been incapacitated by the coffee pot, rule 8. I'll elaborate on this one eventually. And we'd been hit with a midwinter blizzard that had knocked the power out cold. We had a generator running to do things like keep us from freezing to death while we were snowed into the building. And as I've mentioned before, we're so used to losing power that we've got a whole system for checking people in and out offline. But there's just something extra eerie about the place, with nothing but the dingy emergency lights on. I'm not afraid of the dark, but I'm not a complete numbskull either. So I am afraid of the library when I ought to be, and that night was teeming with reasons. It was just the three of us, me, Wiley and Matt, all huddled behind the circulation desk together. There weren't any patrons coming in because nobody could get out of their houses, and although there was plenty we technically could have kept busy with, we'd come to an unspoken agreement that splitting up would be B-movie stupid. So there was nothing left for us to do but wait it out and talk. Matt isn't a particularly conversational guy, unless he's in the right mood to be, but I guess that night had been enough to bring it out of him. The borderline functional alcoholism too. Well, that's borderline alcoholism, not borderline functional. I'd never seen him drink on the job before, but there was no way we'd see a single other person before we made it out of here, so it didn't really matter. Also, his establishment, his business, above my pay grade to question. He wasn't drunk yet, but he'd been nursing a tumbler of bourbon for the better part of the night, and he was clearly a little less inhibited than usual. "This fucking place," he muttered, raising his glass to me in question. I shook my head. I don't drink, which Matt knows and knew then, but it was the only solace he had to offer me in the moment. "Do you think it will always be worth it?" I asked him, keeping it open. Wiley tried to swipe Matt's glass while he wasn't watching, earning them a swat to the back of the head. I'm fairly sure they were of the legal drinking age, but Matt's always looked at them way too much like his kid to be cool with instilling any bad habits in them. "I don't know if it's ever been worth it," he admitted. "But it's my responsibility now." I stood from my seat, pushing myself up onto the desk so that I'd be fully facing him. "What do you mean, now?" Matt hesitated. "Jesus, I need a smoke," he sighed. "It's complicated. This building can't just fall into anybody's lap. The man who owned it before me, he didn't run it as a library, but he did run it with the same understanding of it that we have today. Before I took over, it was a dry cleaner's." So close, I muttered under my breath. "What?" "Oh, nothing. I just thought it was probably a laundromat, because... Never mind. Go on." Matt went on. "His name was Jung Hiroshi. He and his father migrated here from Osaka when he was in his teens, after his mother passed away, and his father bought it from a commercial real estate agency for next to nothing. There wasn't anything wrong with it fundamentally. No issues with the foundation. Nothing electrical. Nothing the inspectors could find. He knew it didn't make sense that they were selling it for so cheap, but he just chalked it up to wanting it out of their hair. It wasn't being used for anything at the time, which meant it was easy enough to renovate. And the Hiroshis had run a dry cleaning service back in Japan, so they knew what they were doing. Made a decent living pretty quick. Everything was going smoothly at first. They were adjusting well, fitting into the community. Jung was in his sophomore year of high school, so unsurprisingly, there was some racist bullshit to be had, but For the most part, it was pretty smooth sailing. He made some friends, met a girl, graduated, married her. Matt paused, knocking back the last of his current drink and refilling his glass halfway. They started trying for kids about 5 years later, but it never took. They both had all the tests run, and the doctors said everything seemed to be in working order. My opinion, the universe was looking out for some poor sucker who would have inherited this place one day. So, wait, how did you end up with it? Wiley asked. How'd you even meet? You don't seem like the kind of guy who's ever had something dry cleaned. Matt hazily held up a hand, signaling that Wiley wait. I'll get there, he said. Anyway, not only could they not get pregnant, but around that same time, Jung found out his father was sick. Cancer. It had spread to his lymph nodes before they'd caught it, and it was so aggressive that none of the oncologists they spoke to recommended that they even try treatment. They said it would just cause him more pain, put his body under more stress. Obviously, Jung and his wife put the idea of starting a family on the back burner. His father declined alarmingly quick, and one evening, he called Jung to his bedside for a talk. About the business. About all things. Jung tried to tell him it wasn't important, that he would handle all the technicalities himself when the time came. But his father was insistent. There were things Jung didn't know, he said. Things he had to be prepared for. Jung had spent his fair share of time in the shop, especially in the few years since he'd graduated high school, but not nearly to the capacity that his father had, and not ever alone. His father made sure of that. The largest difference between then and now is that their hours of operation were typical for a business. They were open during the day, 9 to 7 through the week, 9 to 5 on the weekends. Things are calmer during the day. Wiley can attest to that, yeah? Oh, yeah, Wiley agreed. I mean, it's not like everything just stops, but it's a whole lot different. If you'd only ever been here during the day, you could totally write everything off as something innocent. Exactly, Matt concurred. So, having never been inside past closing time, Jung didn't know to be weary. And the most dangerous thing you can do in this building is be oblivious to it. His father had to be sure that he was ready for what was to come. So, Jung sat down at his father's bedside, and his father began to tell him a story. One that Jung eventually told to me. It went like this. Once upon a time, there was an herbalist. She worked quietly and discreetly from her home for many years. But eventually, her clientele grew so large that she'd outgrown her small space and sought out a local landowner for an opportunity to lease a property from him. He had just one open, he told her, but she was welcome to it if she could pay the price. She was shocked. She'd expected protest, if not flat-out refusal. It was far past the age of true witch trials, but still, men didn't tend to take too kindly to women in medicine, not to mention ones who opened their own honest business to practice it. But he was wholly uninterested in her operations, as long as they brought him money each month. So, she signed the contract on the spot, and that was that. The building was hers. A fair few years passed, and all went swimmingly. The woman never married, nor did she bear children. But she was successful and fruitful, and a pillar of her community. She healed the sick, soothed the restless, and helped those on their way out of this life through to the other side. Until the unthinkable happened. Of course, health is fickle. There were plenty of occasions on which she was unable to cure an ailment. But this was different. One evening, a mother bustled into the apothecary, holding her son to her chest. He was wrapped in a blanket, and the herbalist expected to see an infant. But when his mother lay him down on the work table in the shop, she saw that he was a young boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. "What troubles him?" the herbalist asked, rushing to his side. "A fever," the boy's mother replied. "I've bathed him in ice, kept him from food, given him plenty of water. Nothing will bring it down. Please help him." "Of course," said the herbalist. "A bit of willow tincture, and he should be good as new." The boy's mother gripped the herbalist's hand. "Thank you," she said. "I haven't much, but I'll pay what I can." The herbalist waved her off. "I won't hear of it," she insisted. "The work is payment enough." Once she had fetched the tincture, she turned the boy onto his back and wet his lips with a sponge to encourage them to part. He wasn't conscious, but his frail body complied, his tongue darting out to catch the moisture. "Very good," the herbalist encouraged, though she was sure the boy couldn't hear her. Swiftly, she unscrewed the tincture's dropper cap and squeezed the top to fill the syringe, lifting it to the boy's open mouth and releasing it at a gradual but steady pace. "Is that it?" his mother asked after a moment. "It is," the herbalist confirmed. "He should wake, improved in a couple of hours. If his fever rises again, bring him back to me." The mother and son took their leave. They had only been gone less than an hour. However, when they returned, the mother frantic, the boy convulsing in her arms, and Matt shook himself out of the retelling, eyes downcast, and chugged down another few fingers of bourbon. "Well," he said, "you can probably gather the rest. Anyway, turned out the son was deathly allergic to salicin, which is the active ingredient in willow bark. Killed him as soon as it set in." "Shit," Wiley whispered, fist pressed to their mouth. "Yeah." Matt laughed humorously. "Shit. Now, the woman, his mother, didn't seek persecution against the herbalist. She was devastated, obviously, but she knew no internal harm had been done." "How?" I asked. "Why didn't she think her son had been poisoned or something?" "Because," Matt explained, "the herbalist took some of the tincture in front of her to prove that nothing in it was toxic, and when that still wasn't enough to completely convince her, she asked to take some herself. Apparently, she said at least she'd be with her boy if it killed her, but it didn't, of course. And as fucked up as she was about the whole thing, she wasn't willing to cast blame where it wasn't due. But it was a village, a small one at that. Word traveled quickly, and soon there wasn't a person within earshot who didn't know the woman's son had died at the hands of the herbalist. So, of course, she was ostracized from the community as a whole, which meant what? No income, Wiley guessed. Matt shook a finger at them pointedly. That's right. No income. Nobody was paying or trading for her tinctures or balms or teas anymore, and there was only so much she could forage, especially in winter. She was on her way to starving to death quick, and she'd made her peace with that fact. In her eyes, it was her penance. She knew she hadn't killed the kid on purpose. but she still believed she deserved her suffering for taking the life of an innocent. So, she resigned herself to her fate. But then, as the herbalist slept, she dreamed. And in her dream, there was a figure, tall and lean and shadowy black. It approached her as she was in reality, lying on her side in her bed, and brushed a lock of her fragile hair away from her ear. "I am the scorekeeper," it rasped, hot breath trickling down her neck. "I was called to pay you a visit. Do you wish to settle a debt?" The herbalist watched her own unmoving body from above, well aware that she wasn't awake, but wishing still that she could communicate somehow. Because she did wish to settle a debt, and she thought that maybe it would help her make peace with her passing if she did so, even to a dream. When the scorekeeper spoke again, she was startled at its words. "Worry not. What you mean to speak aloud, speak instead within your soul. I will understand." The herbalist wasn't sure if she believed this, but then again, it was a dream. Her dream. Why shouldn't it be able to read her thoughts? So, she opened her heart to the scorekeeper, letting the torment and turmoil and anguish of the death of the child overtake her spirit so intensely she feared she may never reel it in. She agonized for the boy, for the unfairness of all the years she had inadvertently robbed him of, for the suffering she'd been entrusted to ease, for the hollow, empty life of his mother. She ached for what she had done, intentional or not. She felt as though whatever made her human, whatever made her, might split in two. "Enough," the scorekeeper said finally. "I have what I need. My only question left for you is this. Are you willing to trade places with the boy?" The herbalist, had she been asked beforehand, may have said she would have expected herself to need a moment to think, at least one. But when she said yes, it was with such instantaneous and absolute certainty that she knew without a shadow of a doubt that she meant it. And, evidently, so did the scorekeeper. "You will have from sunrise until sunset to assure that your deal isn't for naught," it told her, wrapping its icy fingers around her wrist. "The boy will need to be unburied if he isn't to suffocate when the exchange is made. Luck be with you." The herbalist woke. Dead, frostbitten tissue encircled her arm. She knew what she had to do. "Wait," I interrupted. "So it was real? Did she really go dig this kid up?" Matt polished off his glass again. "Yep," he said. He'd just barely started decomposing, thankfully. Still totally intact. So she dug him out. I wrote a letter to his mum detailing everything that had happened. I took him home in a wagon and left it outside the door. When she went to sleep that night, she didn't wake up. "But he did," Wiley guessed. "Bingo." Damn. A particularly strong gust of frigid wind howled past the windows, and I looked up to a confirmation that the snow didn't plan to ease any time soon. Damn. I mean, this is, weird. Even for here. Even for us. A dead kid just coming back to life. I don't know, man. Matt shrugged his shoulders. "Believe it or not, it happened. And the reason Jung's father told him the whole story was because it was about to happen again. See, he'd met the scorekeeper, and he was ready to make his own deal. He'd ended up eventually talking to the realtor who'd sold him the building, and he found out a thing or two about its prior tenants. Namely, nobody ever stayed. It took the right kind of person to put up with the things going on here, and usually the people in commercial business weren't it. It had been sold to him for so little, he learned, because it had been vacant for so long that the company was about to cut their losses and have it bulldozed. Historical value be damned. Of course, all the realtors in the agency had started spreading their own little ghost stories, but they didn't know anything. Not really. The scorekeeper, as it turned out, only showed itself to the people who were contractually responsible for the building, and who it knew it could proposition with a deal. So, when it approached Jung's father, it told him the story of the last deal it had made, what felt like lifetimes ago. Well, showed him, more like. When the scorekeeper got close enough, it put its hand on his forehead and projected its exchange with the herbalist, almost like a movie into his mind's eye. That, and everything that had followed. Once a certain kind of sacrifice has been made in any given spot, something about it changes. The scorekeeper showed Jung's father the evolution of this place, the renovations and the partial demos, and the reconstructions, and all the nasty, nightmarish shit that had been drawn here since the first time somebody willingly gave their life inside. When it was over, he knew what his own deal would be, and that he was going to take it, as long as his son complied with his ultimatum. What the scorekeeper offered him was a grandchild, one that he would never meet. His life in exchange for his son's ability to have a baby. He was dying already, but even if he hadn't been, he said he'd have taken it. All he asked in return was that Jung promised to get away, sell the building, leave the state, or hell, the country if he wanted to. Just go somewhere that the baby could never be exposed to this place. Jung still didn't believe it, still thought his dad was just on the brink of death and delusional. But he agreed, just to humor the old man, and that was that. Until he spent his first and only night here alone. I don't know exactly what happened, what he saw. I didn't ask. But I know he was here later than he ever had been before, running reports. And after whatever happened, he never set foot inside again. The next week, his father passed. The week after that, his wife got a positive pregnancy test. He listed the building the same day. Had all the equipment cleared out, locks changed, the whole nine. And I just happened to be the first unlucky fucker looking for a spot. Before he signed the title over to me, he asked me a bunch of weird-ass questions. If I had a family, if I ever planned to, if anybody was dependent on me. He kept saying he didn't want to do this, that he wouldn't if he had any other choice, but he had to take the money. And then he told me everything. I thought he was off his rocker, of course. Or just trying to fuck with me. I basically told him to stick it where the sun don't shine, and gave him his check. Didn't take me long to realize I'd fucked up. He gave me his number when we met, and told me to call if I had any questions, but warned me that the deal was final. I don't know what made me keep it, but I thank my lucky fucking stars every day that I did. He didn't have a lot of advice for me, seeing as how he didn't actually experience much of what went on firsthand, but at the very least, he could assure me I wasn't on my last marble. And that was more comfort than I could have asked for at the time. He tried to talk me into just letting this place rot, but I knew I couldn't. Somebody would have come sniffing around eventually. And I'm not broke, but I'm not impervious to a high enough offer either, which I knew I'd get eventually. if I just let it sit here. Believe it or not, I've got 1 or 2 morals, and they wouldn't let me pawn this bullshit off on anybody else. Jung's situation was different. If I'd been in his shoes, I would have done the same. He had a wife to look out for, and a baby, and a future. But I just had me, so I kept it. And now it's just, like, people need this place, you know? So, here we are. And I've dragged you into it with me because, I don't know, maybe I'm a pussy. Or maybe I was lonely. Or maybe I'm just a fucking bad person. But you don't leave. None of you ever leave. Even when it gets bad. And I think maybe that's because I do an okay job of keeping you safe. So, I'll keep at it as long as you will. And when we've all decided we can't take it anymore, then we'll reevaluate, I guess. Matt was beginning to slur a little now, and he took one last long drink before sliding his glass down the counter. We still talk from time to time. Jung pretends it's just to catch up, but he's really checking in, keeping tabs, making sure I haven't died. I ask him how the family is. He asks how work's going. I tell him everything's fine, and that's just understood code for I'm alive. We're all still alive. Feels like it ought to count for something. It does. Wiley's voice was slightly strained, and they cleared their throat, clapping a hand gently on Matt's shoulder. It counts for a lot. And hey, if we didn't want to be here, we wouldn't. Okay? None of us. Right, Adam? Yeah, I agreed. Yeah, that's right. I hate to break it to you, but I think you're pretty well stuck with all of us at this point. The corner of Matt's lip tilted up. He blew a breath of laughter out of his nose. Well, that's good to hear, he said. Because one of these days, the scorekeeper's coming for me. And when it does, well, when it's time to make my deal, it better be worth it. It better be for one of you. Hello, sinister listeners. If you've enjoyed this story, then you'll find all the author's information in the description below. For more content, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to succumb to the sinister.